So this is my first video updating the progress on what I'm calling, for now, the logistics game. I need a title for it yet. The purpose of this game is going to be for the player to be able to manage basically a warehouse or a manufacturing plant with product coming in, potentially changing it, or putting it together with other products, storing it, and shipping it out. So you could effectively play this game multiple different ways. You could be a wholesaler, where you are buying bulk items from a manufacturer to your location on the continent or country that you're in on the map, and your local competitors may or may not be selling those products as well. So you would be selling to retailers if you're doing wholesale. You could be the retailer in that location and buying product from AI wholesalers, or you could be material extractors or the manufacturer itself. I've begun the production of assets focused around manufacturing because I believe they're going to be the most complex and really tie into everything. So if I can get the manufacturing aspects down to a pretty solid science, the rest of the game should really fall into place, because manufacturing is going to require raw resources, storing them, changing them, and shipping them, just like everything else. So really, the core of the game is logistics for transporting materials and getting them out and where they belong. But the mechanics behind all of this and the purpose behind all of this is for manufacturing and redistribution. So let's dive right in with the progress that I've already made. Right now, when you begin, there is a blueprint called a Constructor, which right now I have at 0, which is just the corner of this. And you can put in a couple of variables. It should just be length and width on this constructor right now. So we'll go under this constructor. It's already selected. Yep. And then we have length Y and width X. So right now I have it set to 15 and 30. I can bring this up to 30 and 30 and make this more of a square shape. So we will start that. So now, instead of it being long, it's now a square. And it will automatically produce these walls around it. And those have just gotten put in today. So really, they aren't incorporated with anything yet. Eventually, you will have some interaction with them and be able to place like dock doors or man doors or whatever, and they will snap to the surrounding world around the facility. But that's all to come. Right now, let's begin with the absolute most necessary pieces, the grid that you can see highlighted in the yellow here. This grid constructor right up here, it will use these loops along with the width and the Y variables that have been put in, and they will spawn the actual tiles, which is this other blueprint over here. So this will go ahead and spawn the tiles across the coordinates and multiply them by the distance that they are, and they should be 100 by 100. And these tiles are just literally a plane that has an event graph attached to it. And the rest of this spaghetti mess over here that I just made today needs all tidied up, along with everything else that needs tidied up, is just to create the walls around it. And then the spawn actor, the blueprint for the wall, is going to have stuff assigned to it as well. But starting at this grid tile, which is just this guy here, every single one of the grids is its own blueprint, and this blueprint doesn't do really... Oops, I'm sorry, we're on the wrong one. The blueprint doesn't do anything really besides change its color when it's when the cursor comes over it. So it will... I don't know why this sequence is still here, but it will call to the controller and set the material for like that, the yellow color that you see highlighted. Then when the cursor comes off of it, it brings it back to the showroom floor, so it doesn't just create a trail of yellow behind it. But it's also setting a variable that it's calling from the controller. So it calls to the controller, and it sets the variable that is in the controller called grid location, which if we run over to the controller, it assigns grid location to its own local variable, grid location from controller, which all of the objects that you will spawn into the game, such as conveyor belts, assemblers, pallet areas, shelves, yada yada yada, will all rely on the coordinates from this grid. So this is setting or telling anything that calls to this where the exact center of that tile is. So this way, when we go ahead and play, and we go to place something, let's say a conveyor belt, it snaps to the center of that tile. It's not just a freely floating object that can be placed anywhere. It actually has to be assigned a tile space. So, as you see, it is perfectly on one of these orange tiles. And the way that I did that was, so let's go ahead and we're going to open the silhouette. Every object, like a conveyor or an assembler, under buildables, now these are all tests. So under completed objects, the two that are either completed or in active development are these. This, under that build menu, is going to spawn a silhouette that is snapped to the location of that currently selected grid tile. Let's go ahead and hide that. So what it does is every tick, I know this is a mess too, but every tick it's going to call for that grid location, and it's going to set that new location as the actor for which is the silhouette. All right, so the silhouette is spawned at whatever location the current grid location is at. You can set the rotation by hitting the R button. That's through the controller as well. All that does is it cycles through a universal rotation variable, which just adds 90 degrees. Every time you hit the R button, it takes this variable, adds 90 degrees to it. If it gets over 360 degrees, it sets it for 0. Let's see. Let's get to the silhouette again. So the silhouette, I know it's a mess. Oh, I hate it. But it checks for overlapping actors on its primary collision box. So in the viewport, there's one that sits just inside its bounds. These are all 100 by 100, but this sits just inside of it. And the silhouette cannot be placed over another object that has a box in the same location. So if we look over at the conveyor that this silhouette will spawn upon being clicked on, so when it's clicked, if there's nothing over it, it will spawn the object, the actual conveyor, and then it will delete itself if shift is not held down. That way, if you can hold shift and place multiple, it'll delete itself, and then it'll spawn in one of these, which is the actual conveyor. And this actual conveyor has a similar hitbox. This is what the silhouette is checking for. So that way you can't place objects on top of other objects and make them clip into each other. This checks for that. Now on these conveyors, there's these additional collision boxes. We have X positive, Y negative, Y positive, and X negative. And what this does is this allows me to take this blueprint and communicate with neighboring blueprints. So if, for example, this conveyor here was placed, it will be checking its negative X hitbox right here, its collide box. If there's something in the negative, then it can call to it. So let's see. For example, over here, if something is in its negative, which is the preceding conveyor, which would be a conveyor that is trying to send objects to it, or whatever it is, whether it be an assembler or a conveyor or whatever, it will call to that through this, and it will pull certain variables, and these variables are at the end of this conveyor's process cycle. So really how this works is, it's probably better to demonstrate visually. We will go ahead and place a couple of these. Oops, something is going on here. Let's go ahead and hopefully I didn't change something. Okay, so we will go ahead and place some of these. So what's happening is these boxes will never truly overlap. They will always be up to 4 slots. We can kind of visualize that here. So this is box A, those are the contents. This is the quantity of contents in there, and you can clear it and you can see it'll move back to none. And now there's nothing here, but there are 3 other boxes here, each with 16. The reason that we have boxes is because I've set a default variable within the conveyor just so I can visualize items running through it. I'm going to return back out of here. I guess we didn't need to do that, but so in this conveyor, I have 4 processes divided up, A, B, C, and D. What A does is it calls to a variable in this previous conveyor that is set right here, because the previous conveyor is going to be identical to this one. So when I set a universal variable, I can call to it, to this specific object before the conveyor that is colliding with that X, that negative X collide box. I can pull all these variables and I can actually set them too. So A, for example, which is just the first animation through the timeline, all it does is just change the X location. So it'll change it, since these are exactly 100 meters or 100 centimeters or whatever the unit is, 100 units of measurement long, it will start at negative 100 or negative 50, and this timeline will bring it to negative 25, which will go from the entrance of the conveyor to the end of A. If the previous quantity over here, which would be D on this conveyor, which would be D on the previous conveyor as well, if that quantity is greater than 0, which means that it has something to hand off, it might have like 16 right now box A's in its possession, and it's ready to hand them off. What it'll do is it will also call and see if this box, this current slot in the conveyor, is empty. If it's empty and there's something to be handed off previously, it will go ahead with this function. There is also a Boolean to verify that it is actually coming from an X plus component and not like an X minus or a Y plus or a Y minus. That way it's not extracting information from a conveyor when it shouldn't be. And what this does is then it runs through, it checks to see if its own animation has finished, because if it can receive information all the way up and until this, without this animation, it can receive information up and until this timeline is set to 0. So it could pull infinitely fast unless it has a check. So animation finished. If that's also true along with everything else, it will allow the process to continue. It will immediately set it to it is not finished because it is just beginning. It will set the mesh, which right now is just these boxes. So moving object B, it is just a small paper box, number 2, I guess. Eventually there will be other things. So if we have an engine running through, I don't want it to look like a box, we can set that mesh. It moves along. It sets the mesh that it receives from the previous, and it sets the previous target coming from the casted conveyor. It sets that to the visibility of that to invisible. We don't want to see that anymore because we don't want to visualize a box or whatever it is that isn't there. We don't want to see it because it has already begun right here to visualize this slot, which is a perfect overlap of the predecessor. The timeline continues over a period of 1.25 seconds to make a combined total of 5 seconds from beginning to end on a conveyor to push a box through. This does its little thing. It updates the relative location using this timeline. It moves object A that is now visible, and once it gets to its new location, it jumps through this whole series of setting its own contents and then wiping the previous, and then it sets its own quantity and wipes the previous. Now there's 3 here and there's 2 here for each. So this is the contents, there's 2. This is the quantity, there's 2. And that is because it's probably a redundant process. But if we jump all the way to the end, this is process D that this is technically calling from on the previous conveyor. It sets a D value quantity, but then it also sets this universal X quantity, the X plus quantity. And then it sets the previous to 0. So that is a total of 3 quantities that are altered. And I probably could pull just quantity D here and not worry about universal X. But I like that there's a universal X quantity because now if I have something like an assembler that only has 1 slot in it, I'm no longer having to call from D or whatever it would be. If it was a conveyor trying to pull from an assembler that only has 1 slot, then it's got to call from A as well. The previous X plus quantity, which actually is set here, which is pulled from universal X plus quantity, can be the same amongst everything that I ever wanted to call from. So all I have to do is say, well, if I'm calling to a conveyor, and this is a conveyor, then it's going to set the universal X quantity to this. Well, that's fine, but now I can set previous X quantity to the universal X plus quantity of a assembler, and it will still make sense. Because an assembler is going to assign a universal X plus quantity, not a D quantity, because there's not 4 slots in it, so it's not A, B, C, and D. I don't want to have to think that. I think about all that while I'm making an object. So we're using universal quantities, and we are resetting them then accordingly. I could probably just actually eliminate the D quantity, and run everything off of that universal quantity, but that's probably for another time. But so A runs through its process, it's pulled its contents, it's pulled its quantity, and it has finished its animation. That's good. Now B is always checking. Has A, this over here, finished its animation? If not, then it's not going to do anything. If it has finished its animation, right? Not this, it's this right here. So, so if A has finished its animation, is that right? No, I guess B doesn't wait for that. I guess it would automatically pull from that anyways because it's not going to have these set until that's finished. So I apologize. The animation sets are for itself, just not to run into its own loop. So it's actually going to be looking for its own animation being finished and handed off whatever information it needed to hand off. If it's 0, so if B has no content in it, it has already handed it off, its animation is finished, it doesn't have any information running in it, has no box on it, then the value of A before it needs to be something. So for example, if this has the 16 box A's that it already starts with, it has run through its animation and it is sitting there at the end waiting to be handed off with 16, box A's. then this says, okay, well, that has 16. It's greater than 0. I'm going to pull that, and I'm going to run through its cycle, just like A did. It's going to pull the mesh from it. It's going to set the mesh visibility, or set the mesh here, and then it's going to toggle A's visibility. A can be invisible now because it no longer is going to have any content. It's going to then set its own visibility, B, like the second slot. It's going to set its box to visible exactly where A went invisible, so there's a seamless transition there. It'll play the timeline, which adjusts the X location now, which is -25 to 0, and then C is 0 to +25 on that X line, and then D is going to be -25, or I'm sorry, +25 to +50, the very end, which is where A picks up if this were a preceding conveyor. And it all just kind of seamlessly travels together and sets its own information after animation and everything else. And it prints these little texts, which you can see if I run it, kind of show up in this corner. And it just gives me the quantity. It just prints the quantity of the conveyor and what color is kind of representative to the area. So it's kind of difficult to tell which color is which with so many going on. But if we go ahead and get to the last two boxes, it should be blue is second place, red is third, purple is last, or something like that. Blue is last, yellow is third, purple is second, and red is first. And we can go ahead and check these contents. Like I said, box A, 16. We can clear them. So that way, if you've changed a conveyor over from, apples to screws, you're not trying to put apples in a assembler that is being assigned to work with screws. It's just not going to work. The assembler is going to kick it out. So you have an assembler, and right now we have box A to box B's. That's great because we have all box A's. But if we try to shove box B's in here, it's not going to do anything. So we would have to clear this machine and clear the preceding conveyor and say, whoa, there's a problem here. These are box A's. That's fine. It's going to go ahead and take it. It's going to go ahead and crush it. And it's right now I don't have it set, but this animation will reverse. There's a little thing that comes down in there and show you. So let's take it from that way, do a little bit of rotation. And so, like I said before, it's a universal rotations variable. So if I've already had something placed this way, the next one that I place is going to be trying to place the same direction. So this box will come in, this little animation shows up, crushes it, and it's going to change it and spit it out. That's not done yet. That's in the works, but what else do we have to kind of go over? When this is done, it goes ahead and when you click on it, it snaps the camera around. I had a little bit of problem with this. Originally, I wanted two cameras to be in the same blueprint. And when I do that, depending on which one is active, depends on which one the camera will snap to when it is clicked on. But I needed to go from... I needed to go from being at this bottommost camera, which we can look in this viewport, this little kind of oblong looking camera. I needed to go from there to up here, but if I place two cameras and I turn this one off on the event graph, and then I turn the other one on immediately, it will either snap right to it, or if it's reverse, if that one's on and then this one turns off, or if I turn this, like the first one off that it's already viewing from, and then turn the second one on, it doesn't snap to it. It just resets the camera to somewhere underneath the conveyor, which was frustrating. I couldn't blend it to the next camera, so I actually had to physically take the XYZ location and then the roll, pitch, and yaw of that new camera position and move the camera physically, and then reverse the timeline. And when it was finished, it will deactivate or activate actor components or whatever. So, it was kind of a pain to figure that out. Let's see. I think I have some more content in here. We've gone over the grid tiles and how they work, the constructor, and that it places all the grids. We have the controller, the pawn. The pawn is nothing more than really a camera on a spring arm. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that's in the works right now, really. So we have the menus, like the assembler menus, or the conveyor menus that pop up. All those widgets are worked on and functional. We have some movables. That's what I call them. So a pallet, and this pallet is actually assigned boxes. So there's these, all these boxes. If we highlight all of these, and we make them all visible, we can see in the viewport what it looks like with boxes attached to it. But without the boxes, it's just a pallet. And what's unique about that is if it has anything greater than 0, if the value on the pallet, so let's say there's a quantity of items on a pallet, you're gonna have to set the visibility per box based on that quantity. So right now I just have it in increments of 2. I think each box is going to hold like 24 items or something. I forget the math. I have it written down, but after like 24 items, it will jump up to the next. In this case, it's 2. So if it's greater than 0, 1 to 24, it will be visible. And you want that bottom box to always be visible because you don't want it to disappear when the next box shows up. That doesn't make any sense. So 2 or greater, the next one's there. 3 or 4 or greater, quantity in there, the next one's there, and the next until the final. And then once it reaches 24, in this instance, it will set a boolean that it is full and that no further objects will be allowed placed on the pallet. Again, these numbers are going to need changed around depending on what is on them. But yeah, other than that, that's the gist of everything. I kind of want to start working on the world around the warehouse. I want it to all be based off of this construction grid, so that way it's all placed at the beginning of playing the level. The road that might surround the building, so that way when you go ahead and place like a drop-off point, which will be snapped to a wall, it will be like a trailer backs up to it, then a forklift can pull pallets off of, or a truck can back up to it and people can just pull the individual boxes out. Maybe like a male-looking truck, like a box van or something like that, can have a parking space and stuff can be hand-delivered for smaller starter operations, all sorts of things. Mail, so you can get things shipped, but it's all of that logistics is going to be done through contracts. So when you have your company running, you're going to have contracts where you need, 500 steel. So you order 500 ingots of steel, and that's a contract. The supplier is going to, I forget how I have the logistics mapped out. I do believe it is one directional. So you don't have to go and get your material, that gets dropped off to you, but you do have to ship out your own material. So you'll have trucks from whether it be competitors or suppliers or whatever, dropping material off at your drop-off points. And then you will also have trucks that you have to load and send out. Now you can contract that stuff out as well, so you can have shipping contracts where you could run this game as strictly a shipping company. You can buy a truck and just send it out on contracts, and it will go and pick up materials from one location and fulfill the contract by setting it off or by dropping it off at another. Perfectly plausible means to make money in the game, but it would make probably more sense to be actually handling that material yourself. So you might order items, and your supplier will deliver them to you, and you might put them all on shelves and have them all organized. And then as people order from you, a markup, you create a contract. So I am selling X items at X price, and people can buy that contract outright and say, well, I want all 5,000 units, or I might need only 250. And then you can fulfill that contract accordingly. The neat part about this game, I think that's going to be a real attractor, is going to be what I call a global economy. You're going to be able to play this locally with settings that you set up. Is it going to be on easy, medium, hard, impossible, like Great Depression style? The economy sucks. It's everything you get shipped in is expensive, and nobody really wants to buy anything for much more than that. So you're going to have to really milk it out. But you could also set it on easy to where the economy is great. Suppliers are willing to sell to you for way below market value, and people are willing to buy from you for way above it. That's all going to be on the local-based gameplay. There will be a little bit of a campaign where you might start off in like a garage, and you might go ahead and start a very small company, try to get it profitable, and then expand. But with this global economy idea, you would be in an economy with all of the other players that are playing in that economy. So you would start a business, and depending on how many other players playing this game are selling, I don't know, like let's say you're making cell phones. Depending on how many cell phones are in supply is going to affect the price based on the demand. So you might be selling cell phones along with 250 other players, and you might each have 100. So that is what, 25, if they're each 125, so that's 2,500. So there's 2,500 phones in demand, and if that market floods like that, then they're not going to be worth very much. You might want to hold on to them. And depending on the player base too. So if this ends up taking off and there's a lot of players, then the economy might adjust a little bit every day, so that way it can accommodate all these players. Because over time, without an adjustment, you would end up with a whole lot of suppliers and no demand at all, because the supply would overwhelm demand without ever changing. But just like in real life, that demand and supply they do reach an equilibrium over time. But I think that it would be very interesting to compete with other players in that economy. Eventually, I would like contracts to be met globally too. So somebody has 5,000 but that they would like to sell at this price. It's all competitive. You might have another player that's selling that at a different price, but they might be further away. So you're going to have to take shipping into account and several other factors, and actually buy out contracts from other players. Hopefully, it doesn't become some like malicious competition where you end up with billionaire companies that can just buy out all these contracts. I think there should be nerfs in place to help all players play kind of on a level playing field. But anyways, this is the pretty limited progress of the logistics game that I've been working on. But once these components are put into place, I think the rest of everything should fall in pretty easily. Still needs a lot of polish, still needs a lot of work to be done with like the roads around it and the logistics and the economy. All of that still needs to be made, but I'd like to think that that wouldn't be too insane to actually complete and accomplish. But anyways, that's everything I think wrapped up for the most part. There's some other things that I've been working on, but they're incomplete and really not worth explaining, I think, at this point. But yeah, I will make another video when I reach another milestone somewhere hopefully in the near future.